Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us, and we hope everybody is well. I'm Mike Gala, president of the Portland Timbers and Thorns. I'm also the newly elected board chair for the Portland Business Alliance. Thank you all for taking time out of your day for joining us for the release and discussion of Partners in Diversity's Retention Project. We have a great program today and a great audience with more than 800 people registered for today's program. We encourage you to follow the Alliance, the PBA, on social media for updates on news and events like today's. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and elsewhere. And also, please follow Partners in Diversity for all of their news and updates. You can find PID on Twitter, Instagram, and elsewhere at DiversityPDX, at DiversityPDX. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. A recording of today's presentation and links for the resources mentioned will be available shortly after the conclusion of the program. And of course, none of these events could happen without the incredible support we get from our communities. So first, I'd like to recognize Partners in Diversity for all of their ongoing efforts and their terrific work on the Retention Project. And I'd also like to thank today's event partners: Oregon Business and Industry, Oregon Business Council, the Port of Portland, and Greater Portland, Inc. Thank you so much for your support. If you have any questions during today's presentation, we ask you to please use the Q&A tool that you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom window. The only questions we'll be able to handle today will be through this tool, so feel free at any point to use that tool and submit your questions. We have a special program for you today. Over the past year, the team at Partners in Diversity has been working on a study taking a closer look at diversity retention. Basically, it seeks answers to the following questions. What are the challenges for employers when it comes to retaining diverse talent? And what are the primary reasons why people of color leave our organizations and often our market? Obviously, the findings are critically important right now, and our hope is that you can use them as a guide in your respective efforts to make your workplace more inclusive and equitable. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of Partners in Diversity, Mari Watanabe. Mari.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Andrew Hone and the PBA for giving us this platform. We really appreciate it. Hello, everyone. This work started a year ago, and I'm happy to be here today to walk you through our research findings, the recommended solutions for employers, and to learn from our executive panel on how they implemented some of these solutions into their own organization. Unfortunately, we can't meet in person, but I appreciate your time and commitment to embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace and in the community. And thanks to our Partners in Diversity members, as well as our colleagues from the PBA, OBI, GPI, Oregon Business Council, and the Port of Portland for being here. I'm also grateful to PGE and the Oregon Community Foundation for funding this project and supporting Partners in Diversity in so many other ways. Thank you. Partners in Diversity is an affiliate of the Charitable Institute of the Portland Business Alliance. They serve as our fiscal agent, and we have a board of directors and committees that help guide our work. And like the PBA, we are a membership organization and currently serve almost 300 members across Oregon and Southwest Washington. We were founded in 2005, 15 years ago, by local CEOs who understood the business imperative of attracting, hiring, and retaining greater racial and ethnic diversity in the professional workforce. We provide educational programs, resources, and trainings for employers, as well as programs and resources to support our professionals of color. Say Hey is the largest multicultural networking event in the state where our newest professionals of color who move here can find and build community. It is our signature event. We have several other community building programs geared for families and interns. And Breakfast for Champions and Equity Conversations are workshops and discussions for leaders, HR, and diversity practitioners. And we also have programs for CEOs and leaders as this work starts at the top. And starting next week, we have a new series of programs for our members as they work to recover from this health, economic, and social justice crisis. They are listed on your screen. In addition to our programs, Partners in Diversity works to educate the community about diversity, equity, inclusion through our research. One of our research projects was announced in 2017, and this was a report on ways that employers can better recruit from our communities of color. We conducted this research based on our members' challenges in recruiting from that community. The result was new strategies for recruiters to better recruit, and this research also informed Senate Bill 855, which the PBA helped pass in the state legislature in 2019. This bill requires the state licensure boards to find faster pathways for immigrants and refugees with advanced degrees that move here to get re-credentialed. Now, sharing a challenge faced by Partners in Diversity members is the ability to retain professionals of color for the long term. They are often recruited by an employer to move here, but many leave after 2 to 3 years and move out of our region. Anecdotally, we can write the list of the whys, but hard data is needed to make real change. So we set out to understand why professionals of color move here and then leave the region. Once we knew the hard data, our next step was to develop recommended solutions that employers could implement that would support professionals of color in the workplace. You can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. All with the goal to retain diverse talent here. Why this is important and why it matters to your business. So studies have shown diverse companies outperform those that aren't. That's because diverse teams bring many different perspectives, which leads to greater innovation. Employees are exposed to different backgrounds, abilities, and ideas. And according to a recent McKinsey study, diverse companies generate 33% more revenue than companies that do not have diversity from top leadership on down. So in addition to being a good business strategy, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a moral imperative. Other studies have shown that employees perform better and are more resilient when they feel safe, accepted, and respected. They're also more likely to stay in one geographic location longer and develop relationships that serve the interest of the greater community. Then there's the cost of replacing an employee. As you know, it can be very expensive and varies depending upon level of seniority. In 2019, the Work Institute estimated the hard cost to be about 1/3 of the cost of the salary, and that's on the low end. Other studies have shown that cost as high as 1.5 to 2 times the cost of the salary. So with this in mind, we took our grant funding from Oregon Community Foundation and PGE, and we hired Martinez Organizing Consulting, headed by Dr. Larry Martinez, to develop, conduct, and analyze the study. Dr. Martinez is also a Partners in Diversity Say Hey honoree from October 2016 when he moved here. He is a leading expert in the field of industrial organizational psychology with a passionate focus on diversity, inclusion, and allyship within the workplace. He is currently a professor in the Department of Psychology at Portland State University. He has been published in the Journal of Applied Psychology, the Journal of Management, the Journal of Business and Psychology, the Journal of Vocational Behavior, and several other publications. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Larry Martinez.
Thank you, Mari, for that introduction. So I'm going to take it from here. In terms of the background of this study, what we did was we wanted to get a really comprehensive understanding of what was happening here in the region, and we wanted to get lots of different data. So we collected data from 30 in-depth interviews with professionals of color, about half of them here. We supplemented that with 5 in-depth interviews with recruitment and retention personnel. So we wanted to follow that up with a large-scale quantitative survey where we took the results of this interviews that guided the types of questions that we were asking and allowed us to understand the phenomenon a little bit better. And then we wanted to see if that was generalizable beyond just the people that we had interviewed. So we reached out to over 1,000 professionals of color, usable responses, and you can see the demographic breakdown of the respondents. It was pretty stratified in terms of race, mostly Black and African American, and it skewed more toward being more heavily represented by women, which is actually pretty common for survey responses like this. So the way that we collected the data was pretty much in line with what we would expect. And we did all of the collection and analyses in line with the top scientific practices. We can talk more about that if you like. In terms of the background of the participants, most of them actually moved to the region. They were from outside of the region. About 86% came here. That's a combination of jobs about Portland and the area in general. And these responses, people could pick more than one, so that's why it equals more than 100%. In terms of the representation of job titles, we see that levels of associations represented here, and about half of the participants indicated that they had some supervisory experience. So we're pretty confident that we have a pretty good sample that's representative of the type of people that we're trying to get information about. In terms of the results, so in the quantitative data, we asked about people's experiences at work and their experiences in the community. And in terms of their experiences at work, you can see they're not very positive. So 74% reported that they had experienced discrimination while living here. 70% experienced work-related strain, which is an indicator of stress. And only 17% agreed that their organization was supportive of them and of diversity practices, and 27% agreed that they were satisfied with their jobs. So the overall sort of picture is fairly negative about the way that people experience their work lives. When we look at the qualitative interview data, what came out as primary concerns is a lack of diverse representation among the company's workforce. So we'll see later the high experiences of tokenization. They also reported a lack of accountability among organizational leaders, especially when diversity issues were raised. So people would bring forward issues and then not feel like those issues were being taken seriously and being actioned upon appropriately. They also reported experiencing a wide range of microaggressions and discrimination at all organizational levels. So this is probably not surprising given the statistics that we see here. And they also reported that they felt like an outsider within their own organizations, and that they often had to they felt like they had to work harder than their non-professional of color counterparts in order to get the same types of benefits. There are also a few quotes from the qualitative data that I'll share with you that sort of exemplify some of the experiences. So one person said, "I had no idea I was killing my career with my choice of moving here. Had I known, I may not have moved at all. It's not been a good choice for me." Another one said, "I experienced racism and microaggressions on a near daily basis." Another said that I was accosted at work by a coworker who is associated with the Proud Boys. With no witnesses, he is still employed and very much involved with groups aligned with white supremacy. And the work environment acts as a filtering system for professionals of color. Even if we get the job, the environment is so uncomfortable that the culture itself acts as a filter. So by combining the quantitative data with the qualitative, we get a much better understanding of what's happening in terms of people's work lives. in terms of experiences in the community, we wanted to recognize and appreciate the fact that people just don't work in Portland. They also live in Portland and the region. So we asked about the community, and you can see here that the percentages are much actually worse than what people reported experiencing in the workplace. So 97% reported discrimination in the community. And if you remember, the number here for discrimination in the workplace was 74%. So we're seeing a much higher rating here. Only 1% agreed that they felt included in the community. 16% reported that they felt comfortable in restaurants and stores and public places. And 96% said that they that people in the region consider themselves to be more tolerant than they actually are. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. And one of the things that I want to just highlight here is that these numbers, especially the 97 and the 1%, can't really get much worse. So we were a little bit surprised that the numbers were so egregious. I think we knew that there was a bit of a problem, but we're surprised to see these numbers come in. The other thing that I want to highlight is that these data were collected last summer. So with all of the increased tension following the murder of George Floyd, it's left to, well, you can wonder about what the types of data might look like right now. So one of the things that they commonly said in the interviews was that there was a pervasive sense of what the respondents called Portland nice. And Portland nice can manifest in a couple of different ways, but basically what it means is that there is this sense of positive interactions. People are generally nice, people are friendly, people extend invitations for things and sort of express a willingness to engage in a positive manner. But when it comes down to actually allocating resources or actually enacting policies or actually showing up and being there for somebody, then there's a lack of follow through with that. So I think one of the ways that that manifests here is that there's a discrepancy also. We asked people about their experiences and their assumptions and their expectations before they moved to Portland. And Portland has a sort of stereotypical reputation for being very liberal, for being very progressive. And I think that that sort of translates into an assumption that it's going to be really welcoming for people who are different and different in all types of ways, including race and ethnicity. And that wasn't really the case, right? So I think that that discrepancy and that expectation and the experiences that they had that didn't align with those expectations was especially jarring. And a lot of the participants said that it was quite shocking the way that they experienced Portland in comparison to what they expected their experiences to be like. So just a couple of quotes that sort of highlight this idea. One person said, "Coming from the South, my friends and family thought that I was escaping much of the racism we experienced. We now know that racism, xenophobia, and prejudice all live here too, but in different, less overt forms. White liberals are often at the intersection in my experience." Another person said, "I had heard of this liberal, creative, progressive climate and found that to be true on the surface. The decision-making apparatus underlying that veneer was extremely conservative." Another person said, "This is a very passive-aggressive place. It feels like living in a house of mirrors." And finally, people in this area practice subtle racism and don't even know it. So these quotes all kind of highlight this notion that there is this veneer, the word that they use, and I think is an appropriate word, where people people coming in assume that it's a progressive and liberal place, and people living here also assume that it's a progressive and liberal place. And what that contributes to is a sense that things are okay, right? We call this a sense of moral licensing, that we as residents of Portland are not susceptible to things like racism and prejudice. And that assumption and that sort of mindset contributes to an inability to recognize when there are problems. So in terms of solutions, we also asked about organizational efforts and accountability, people's experiences related to that. 83% reported that they felt like they had to work harder than their non-POC counterparts 70% reported tokenization, 12%, only 12% agreed that their organization had a diversity-friendly work environment, and only 9% agreed that their organization puts a lot of time and money into diversity initiatives. So this is where we can see, potentially a willingness and a description that there is going to be change, but then not actual change when it comes down to it. So the summary analysis is that the things we can take away is that Portland is considered to be a progressive and liberal place, but that's kind of a veneer that is covering up some pernicious effects underneath the surface. We also see that there are people that are experiencing discrimination at work and in the community with little recourse. That lack of accountability makes it very difficult for people to feel comfortable and to feel like there's a future here. That people also report that there's a difficulty finding social and cultural connections. So one of the things that came out really strongly in the community interviews was a lack of community and a lack of feeling of place and a lack of feeling at home. So we saw in some of the quotes that we included here, the differences that people experienced in Portland they didn't experience in other places. So especially for people that were moving here from more diverse areas where there are community spaces where people can gather and can participate in cultural events. So some of the things that came up quite often in the interviews were a lack of opportunities to just sort of hang out in one's neighborhood, to get the type of food that they want to eat, to go to the type of dance clubs that play the music that they want to dance to. And even basic hygiene things came up quite a bit in terms of finding salons and barbershops that are appropriate for culturally specific needs. So there's a big lacking there. So one of the implications is that I think that one of the things that we need to do is invest more in community and internal practices as well. So I think that organizations have an opportunity and sort of an obligation to help the community. One of the things that we have seen in response to the COVID-19 pandemic is the sense of, we're all in this together. And I think that narrative can play out really well in response to, the racial tensions as well. And I haven't seen that as much. So I think that there's a sense of responsibility there. And I think that one of the things that the qualitative interviews gave us also is a really deep understanding of what these experiences are like. It's really hard to understand those just with statistical data. And what we saw there is that the tokenization and the isolation that people feel is really damaging. And what happens with tokenization is really interesting. You get sort of two different things that are sort of create this paradox, right? When you're tokenized in the organization, that means you're sort of the only person like you that's there. And what that means is that you are sort of isolated. So if something happens at work or in the community, or if there's a news headline that is particularly damaging or traumatic, then it's sort of a feeling of isolation. There's nobody around you that experiences that the same way that you do. And there's nobody around you that might be able to provide consolation and an opportunity to vent. So what that contributes to is a sense of isolation, right? And we use isolation sort of as a punishment. So if you are a toddler and you get in trouble, you get put in timeout. And if you're an adult and you get in trouble, you go to jail. And if you are in jail and you get in trouble even more, you get put in solitary confinement. So isolation is a really, really negative and detrimental experience. And the problem with tokenization too is that isolation is a chronic thing. This microaggressions are very small types of instances, but they happen over and over again over an extended period of time. And what we know about stress is that chronic stress is much, much, much more damaging psychologically and physically than acute stress. So if you have something that happens to you, an earthquake or a natural disaster, you can recover fairly quickly. But a chronic stressor is those are the things that lead to heart disease, that lead to mental illness, that lead to stroke. So that's one thing that I think is really important, that even though we call them microaggressions, their impact aren't micro at all. They have really, really profound impact on the people that are experiencing them. The other thing that contributes to the microaggressions is the fact that they're ambiguous. So because they're such minute sort of instances, it's really hard to regulate them. It's really hard to justify them, and it's really hard to have any action, right? Because there's always this ambiguous sort of cloud over it that doesn't clearly indicate that racism is happening or that prejudice is happening. So that ambiguity is actually really damaging from a psychological perspective as well, because that ambiguity causes rumination, and it causes doubt, and it causes worry, and it causes a lot of mental resources and emotional resources that drain the capacity of people to engage in their jobs and to engage in their communities. So that's really pernicious as well. The other thing that tokenization does is, one, it contributes to a sense of isolation, and then at the same time, it somehow also makes people more conspicuous. So because you're the only person that looks like you stand out more. And what that also means is that you might get attention that other people might not get in situations when you might not want that type of attention. And it means that people are more likely to get asked to do service types of roles, to engage with committees, and to have representation, because we need somebody like you on the committee, right? And that places an undue burden on people. So at the same time, it's isolating and then also conspicuous in nature. So I think, again, the situation is not great right now. And people often say that there is like a chicken and egg problem when we talk about race in Portland, and that it's difficult to recruit and retain people that are at racial and ethnic minorities, because there just aren't many racial and ethnic minorities that are here. And I think, as I think about this a little bit more, it might not be the chicken or the egg. I think it's more the nest. We need to create a climate in our organizations and in the community more broadly that is more welcoming and that is more less isolating to professionals of color. One of the things that I do primarily in my work is allyship training. So I train individual employees within organizations on how to be better allies for one another. And I think what we're seeing here is that we need organizations to be better allies for the region, for the community. Because what we know from that research is that there is a lot of power when it comes to allyship. And at this point, I will go ahead and take any questions that we might have about the data.
So Larry, I have a couple questions in the Q&A box. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, not the chat. So Larry, why do survey responses skew so largely female? Does this that also reflect the breakdown in the workforce? Are POCs largely female?
So the first question, the short answer is I don't know. It's something that we see pretty commonly. We collect data from organizations, we collect data from communities, we collect data from online panels, and it's almost always more representative for women. And I don't know that there's research on why that's the case, but anecdotally, I think women might be just more amenable to taking surveys. In terms of whether that is representative of the professionals of color that are here, I don't think that that's the case. So I don't, again, have data about that, but I don't think that there's any reason to believe that there's an overrepresentation of female professionals of color relative to male.
Great. And then what is the age or age demographics of the respondents?
Ooh, I don't have that right in front of me, but it was, let me see if I can pull this other thing really quickly. No, it's not over here either. I don't know off the top of my head, but it was, you know, I don't have any reason to believe that it was skewed one way or the other. I think it's fairly representative. In other studies like this, we typically get an average age of around 35.
Thank you. Next question is, did any interviewees share any particular strategies or actions that they thought, if implemented more widely, would have contributed to be a more inclusive workplace or community acceptance?
So the short answer is yes, and there are quite a few. I think, you know, some of them are going to be not groundbreaking. I think that a lot of what the concerns are about is not necessarily that there aren't policies in place in these organizations, but that the policies aren't always being enacted faithfully. So that's where the lack of accountability comes through. They recommended also really listening to professionals of color. There was a strong sense that along with this sort of Portland nice narrative, that people would listen to problems, but then not really believe the situation or put the onus of responsibility back on the professional of color to sort of solve the issue themselves and not recognize sort of the systemic issues that might be happening. They recommended, you know, executing things with an equity lens. Pay transparency came out really, really strongly as well. And just a sense of not being defensive. So the participants picked up on this sense that when they went to their organizational leaders, who were mostly, you know, usually white, that there was a response that generally sort of indicated like, well, I'm not racist, and that's not an issue. We don't have a problem with racism here. And even when they're being told that there are problems with racism, that there's a sense of it's not real, right? So really listening and not being defensive, and being open to the idea that things may not be as good as people might think. The other thing that I think I can highlight is that managers need to take initiative for learning about race issues on their own. And the other recommendation that I can highlight is that they recommended having professionals of color in you know, leadership roles where they can have an influence in the way that organizations operate.
Great, thank you, Larry. We're going to have to, unfortunately, we're going to have to move on. I see there are a couple other questions, but you can go to the partnersindiversity.org website under resources. We have this information there, so hopefully those questions will get answered. If not, just let us know. But I am going to move on. So this next part, this slide, so the data and the testimonial you saw might make sense, might make some people uncomfortable, but it's important to know that recognizing the discomfort, being vulnerable, and staying curious are necessary to create culture change. Companies and their leaders that lean into this space and strive to make the workplace more inclusive and equitable will benefit through more productive and resilient teams. And together we will change this narrative for the better. So I want to thank Dr. Martinez for his work in this. And based upon his findings, we put together some solutions based upon that research. And also, as he mentioned, there were some solutions that the interviewees gave. And so we have characterized these solutions into 4 main areas. So 1, employer policies and practices, community support and networking, accountability for leaders, and the 4th, individual support and advocacy. So so although we put these solutions into categories, they are not mutually exclusive. And these ideas, all of these ideas are interconnected and part of an overall retention strategy. So Partners in Diversity, we met with employer community groups already, including Partners in Diversity members, and the Portland Business Alliance's Executive Committee, which we have created a list of thoughtful solutions that employers can do right now. This is by no means a finite list. So Partners in Diversity is committed to making these changes with you. And we have these solutions along with our study posted on our website, partnersindiversity.org. So look for the project under resources section. We provide year-round programs and resources to help employers and leaders like you advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if you're not already a member, please consider joining and connecting with us. So now I really love to move to our panel. So to look for solutions employers can implement in their workplace, we are honored to have with us today a panel of well-respected business leaders who have changed their workplace culture to be more inclusive. So Jeremy Barnacle, Executive Director of EcoTrust, Patrick Kreitzer, President and CEO of Tillamook County Creamery Association, Curtis Robinhold, Executive Director of the Port of Portland. And to lead our panel today, I'm very pleased to have with us Chad Paulson. Chad is the Vice President and General Counsel of Blunt International, a global manufacturer based in Southeast Portland. He joined Blunt in 2006, where he manages domestic and international mergers and acquisitions, serves as corporate secretary, and develops and implements compliance and governance programs. He's a graduate of Oregon State University for his undergraduate work and the University of Oregon Law School for his law degree. He serves on the OHSU Board of Trustees, the Oregon Business and Industry Board, and Partners in Diversity's Leadership Council. So, Chad, throwing it back to you.
Thank you, Mari, and thank you all for participating in this very important webinar. As you may have noticed, there are 3 white men on this panel. Though we have a diverse community with diverse talent, the vast majority of top business leaders in our area continue to be white men. The leaders invited to be panelists were carefully selected, and the fact that they are all male and white is intentional. In order to dismantle the white supremacy structure that still exists today, white men in power must do the work. The men on this panel have leaned into this work and are making positive changes within their own organizations. We hope they will serve as examples to their peers on what can and must be done. We have prepared some questions for the panelists, but have reserved some time at the end for questions from our audience. Please write questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many as possible. I will refer to diversity, equity, and inclusion as DEI throughout. I welcome any panelists to add their thoughts to any of the questions I direct specifically to any other panelist. Now for our panel. Patrick Kreitzer currently serves the dairy families of Tillamook County as the President and CEO of the Tillamook County Creamery Association, or TCCA. Tillamook is more than a century-old farmer-owned cooperative with a leading premium dairy brand and a commitment to providing real food that tastes great. During Patrick's tenure at TCCA, the cooperative has increased revenue by over 50% while growing returns to farmers and expanding its presence as one of the leading consumer food brands in the Western United States. Patrick is a native Oregonian and serves on the boards of the Oregon Community Foundation, the Oregon Business Council, and Hampton Lumber. He has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Washington and an MBA from Harvard Business School. Welcome, Patrick. Jeremy Barnacle has served as the Executive Director of EcoTrust since 2016. From its home base in Portland, EcoTrust advances social equity, economic opportunity, and environmental well-being through a wide range of nonprofit and for-profit efforts. Jeremy has spent over 2 decades working at the intersection of policy, philanthropy, and social change, including 11 years at the global humanitarian organization, Mercy Corps. At Mercy Corps, Jeremy helped guide the organization's global strategy and position the Portland-based nonprofit as one of the most respected humanitarian organizations in the world. Prior to Mercy Corps, Jeremy worked for the State Department, for a U.S. congressman, for several consulting firms, and as a Peace Corps volunteer. He has a bachelor's degree from Vanderbilt and a master's of public affairs degree from the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University, where he also taught a graduate course on the social sector. Welcome, Jeremy. Curtis Robinhold joined the Port of Portland in 2014 and became executive director in 2017. He leads a team of 800 in the visions and operations of our region's airports, marine terminals, and business parks. Prior to joining the port, Curtis was chief of staff to Oregon Governor John Kitzhaber where he oversaw the governor's policy agenda, staff, and policy advisors. Before that, he was managing director of BP Alternative Energy's global gas-fired power business. Curtis was raised in Eugene, Oregon, and has an MBA and Masters of Environmental Management from Yale University. Welcome, Curtis. So let's kick things off by talking about leadership. This question is for all of you. You all have a vested commitment to DEI work at your organization. It is imperative that this work is owned by the top level of leadership. Many times we see employers put the onus on their HR or diversity practitioner to lead this work. Can you tell us about your journey to understanding the role that the CEO or executive leader has in driving DEI efforts in the workplace, and why you believe the top leader must be accountable in creating an equitable and inclusive workplace? Curtis, if you can start us off, followed by Jeremy, and then Patrick, I would appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Chad. It's a really good question. You know, my own journey on this topic started mostly when I was working abroad in Europe and in Africa for about 7 years. And when I returned to the US, I noticed this lack of diversity in the rooms that I was sitting in. And what I noticed more was the lack of richness and the quality of the conversations that I was missing because it was such a sort of uniform group. So, you know, the way I think about diversity inside the workplace and around equity is really treating it like another business priority. It's key to our business, and I need to, as a leader, treat it that way. So actually, Dr. Martinez mentioned it in his work as well. It's really about accountability and how you push accountability into the organization for your expectations. So for me, that's about behavioral expectations of your team. It's about, are you supplying the resources and skills necessary? Are you measuring success and failure? And are you holding people accountable, both for the good outcomes and the less good outcomes? So, you know, really thinking of it as making your business better and deeper and richer is how we tackle it at the port.
You know, from my standpoint, so EcoTrust calls out social equity in its mission statement, and you know has had that for 30 years. But when I arrived as executive director, I felt like, you know, from what I observed, it felt like the organization was sort of under-delivering on that aspect of the mission. So I was curious about it, and I thought it was interesting, and my interest in that coincided with a really important push from our staff. To sort of steer into the equity component of our mission, and specifically racial equity, which hadn't really been part of what we did. And so, you know, we really dug in. And from my standpoint, as an epically privileged white man, really entering with vulnerability and humility, which are not two attributes typically associated with people of my background, has been really important. And you know, we need to be able to acknowledge where we're making mistakes or we've got blind spots, because I do think as a leader, it's our responsibility not, you know, for DEI work, not to rest on the shoulders of BIPOC people, right? I mean, I think your question about, you know, a chief executive, the division of labor between a chief executive and a head of HR or a head of equity, you know, in a lot of organizations, the chief executive is a white man, and the person who leads the DEI initiatives is going to be a person of color. And I think it's really important that the chief executives take that burden and make that their responsibility, or else we're just sort of perpetuating a system that's been unfair for years.
So yeah, so I'll just start by saying thanks to Partners in Diversity for doing this important work and for partnering with Dr. Martinez on the study. You know, the results from the study certainly, I saw the chat reactions, and certainly sobering, but validating for many, I recognize. And it's really important that we bring this to the surface and have real discussions, take real action to drive the real change that needs to happen. So I want to acknowledge and thank for the work that's going on here. You know, the top leader must ultimately be the champion of and driver of culture. And so for me, this includes co-sponsoring our inclusion and diversity work, and being out in front continuously on this topic, both inside the organization and then where there's opportunity and it's appropriate publicly, with messaging about our commitment to building a diverse and inclusive culture. I've learned over the years that culture is more important than strategy, and particularly in two important respects. One is that it's a clear source of competitive advantage. And the second reason is because we have the potential and moral obligation to create a fulfilling and enriching work experience for employees. And, DEI is an important component of culture in both of those respects. So we're going to make better decisions, build stronger teams when we have diverse voices. And when people with diverse experiences and perspectives bring their authentic selves to work. I mean, we heard statistics before about companies outperforming with a more diverse teams. And also it's the right thing to do as we look to create a good life experience for employees, for all employees and all people, to valuing and supporting the whole person that comes to work, not just their contributions in the workplace. So, my understanding of this topic has certainly evolved and changed over time. Understanding the importance of culture, embracing the moral objective of creating a fulfilling and enriching employee experience as an important business outcome, and in evolving my understanding of how people of color and others experience the workplace, including, what the pitfalls of fit and assimilation and some of the other powerful forces that happen in strong cultures, white dominated cultures within business. And so it's an important part of creating that culture that we're looking to create at Tillamook, and that I think business leaders have an obligation to lead into. One thing that I think has been particularly important on our journey, on my journey personally, and then even more so in these last couple of months, is to share my personal experience with DEI within the company and with our employees authentically. And at times this has meant exposing my discomfort and my own opportunities to learn and make changes and step aside where needed to, advocate where needed to, changes to my thinking and action overall. So one of the reasons is that's important, and Chad, as you mentioned, the reason that this panel was put together is those of us that have benefited from these many advantages need to be actively engaged in this work. And I know it means everyone needs to be actively engaged in this work. And by modeling, by modeling this discomfort and sometimes admitting to the defensiveness that arises and all the other challenges that folks have, we're inviting them to lean in that way that they need to, and modeling for them working through this together.
Thank you. That's great. That's great stuff. Curtis, you talked about your journey to owning this work as the ports leader. It's one thing to have top leaders commit to DEI work, but it's another to ensure that internal policies and actions reflect that commitment to DEI. Can you speak to what the port has done to ensure that the necessary DEI policies are implemented?
Yeah, thanks. Great question, Chad. We actually had a bunch of work going on in the port previous to 2013, but most of it was asking employees to volunteer their time on a diversity and inclusion council. And only in 2013, 14 did we start to think about it as being core to who we are and what we do. And so it really required resourcing. We hired some consultants to come in and help us look at what we do both internally and externally. In 2014 and 15, we began to hire people in to help us develop a strategy. So we created an equity policy that then our commission approved, and it rolls into everything that we do. I'll post in the comments or the Q&A some of those outcomes. We try to be as transparent as possible about how we measure and what we've seen in terms of change over time, but it's really about resourcing the issues and entering. Honestly, when we started, we tried a bunch of different stuff, and we're pretty open about saying we don't know what's going to work and what's not. That might have been silly or stupid, but it made a lot of headway for us on willingness to take some risks. And as Patrick says, to just enter and say, look, I don't know the right answer how to do this, but we're going to try and see what happens, and really get the input of all of our employees in how that progresses inside the organization.
Thanks. Quick follow-up. The port is a very large organization. You have 3 airports, 4 marine terminals, 5 business parks. You have 800 employees. Some are union, some are not union. How does the port create enterprise-wide alignment on its DEI efforts?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I mentioned we have a port-wide equity policy, and what happens is each of my direct reports, including a direct report who is responsible for equity, each department created an equity plan with goals specific to that department. They include metrics. They're developed over a period of about 4 months, including community input into what those metrics would be and what expectations were of the port. Each departmental plan has an executive team member, i.e. one of my direct reports, that's responsible for delivery of that piece of the plan. And we're really focused around 3 big goals. They're really what I talk about most inside the organization. 1, increase business participation. 2, create a welcoming place for people to come and work and engage. And 3, help build community capacity, not just for the port, but for our friends and neighbors and business partners as well. So every quarter, departments have to report how they're doing to those metrics. And I hold my executives accountable for that delivery. It's in performance plans. When we have a bonus system in place, because of COVID, we don't have one this year, but it's part of our bonus delivery system. So it's integrated into expectations of the whole organization.
Fantastic. So I want to bring Patrick back into the conversation. Many employers do DEI work as a one-off training, often as a reaction to an internal incident, or they do DEI work as a supportive but not essential program. You mentioned earlier that you've made it core. Can you talk about how Tillamook has made DEI central to its culture and its business strategy?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. So first, as I described before, culture is strategy for us. So when we talk about the business, we talk about our strategies, we talk about our plans for the future. We always talk about our shared values. And in that, we talk about building an inclusive culture. In fact, our values might be the thing that I speak with the organization most about, particularly these days, with a year filled with a lot of challenges and uncertainty like this one. And inclusion and diversity are firmly embedded in our values. So DEI has come to life for us, in particular over the last 2 years, through our building an inclusive culture strategy, which is grounded in the concept of commit and act, which for us is a public, open commitment to take action, to follow the words and aspirations that we have for creating an inclusive culture. And so for us, it's meant creating spaces and conditions where employees can raise their voice, be seen and heard, and have an ability to contribute their thinking and ideas to the overall business. It's meant a complete review and revamp of our recruiting and onboarding, training, evaluation, promotion practices to ensure that we're attracting and selecting diverse talent, and encouraging everyone to bring their authentic selves to the work. That component has also included a number of partnerships and building, an intentional effort to build a pipeline of diverse talent. Our strategy has also included direct and open discussion on the topic of racial equity. I mean, certainly that's accelerated as we've continued to just do better and get better. That's accelerated over these last several months, but that's been reinforced by frequent messaging from the top, from me and other senior leaders, providing resources and calendar-driven events, learning opportunities, and opt-in inclusion circles and other venues, which include bias awareness training and inclusive behavior training and education to continue to drive towards what we call conscious inclusion. And then, of course, you get what you measure. So we've developed a comprehensive work plan that sets tangible goals for us to make progress, and goals that cover a range of activities and outcomes that we believe will help us build a stronger, more inclusive culture in 4 particular areas: diversity of people and perspectives, cultural agility, conscious inclusion, and having a positive impact on societies and communities. So, that's the main part of our strategy. We're also spending time intentionally to evaluate how our brand shows up as a brand that tens of millions or at times hundreds of millions of folks get exposure to across the country. What's our voice? Who are we representing? Are we making inclusive cultural references and sensitive? Are we appropriately sensitive to the voice we're using and the messages we're sending with a brand that has that kind of impact? So those are some of the things that have sort of combined to be, particularly over the last 2 years, to be together are building an inclusive culture strategy.
Fantastic. So let's talk hiring. This is a question specifically for Jeremy, but I welcome anybody to jump in as well. The process, policies, and practices can often be a barrier to recruiting and hiring from a diverse candidate pool. Tell us how EcoTrust has changed its hiring process to successfully bring in diverse talent.
Yeah, thanks. So, we realized 4 or 5 years ago that our team didn't really reflect the region that we serve and didn't necessarily reflect our values, and hired a consultant named Anita Yap, who's based here, to help us think through how we might change our recruitment process to get better results. And so we used a test case with a particular recruit that we were doing and learned some really important lessons that we have now implemented. Some of them are things that Patrick referred to, but for example, now every hire that we do, we have a member of our equity working group, which are existing staff, but who have funded time specifically to devote to this work. Somebody from the equity working group sits on every hiring committee, and they're really part of the process from the very beginning, from the conception of a position description to strategizing about how to actually recruit, to scoring resumes as they come in, to setting up interview questions and mechanisms, all the way through to the final decision. Even though they may sit outside of the hiring of the group that for which the position's being hired, they've got the right to go to the CFO or to me and flag if they feel like the equity considerations really weren't taken seriously in that recruitment process. I'll flag that, like, we weren't always clear enough early on about the decision boundaries of the equity working group member in that recruitment, and that led to some tension, and we had to clarify that. But having an equity working group person on every hiring committee has been a really big deal. We've now started only doing informational sessions, so they're public, they're recorded, they're available to everybody, and that was in part an antidote to what for me had always been part of hiring, which is, who do I know? Who do I trust? I'm going to reach out to my network and see who they recommend. And my friends and friends of friends will come to me and want to have a sidebar conversation about this job and why they're so great for it. And that practice, which for me was completely ingrained, I mean, that's kind of how it was done, is so obviously, deeply seated in structural racism. And if you don't stop doing things like that, you're not going to get different outcomes. So that was really uncomfortable for me because, that's how I tracked folks down. That's how I picked folks. And that clearly was not getting the results we wanted. So, now in recruits now, when people reach out to us, we say, it doesn't matter what our relationship is, you can tune into the information session just like everybody else, which I think has been really helpful. We also require anybody on a hiring committee to take an implicit bias training, which I think is, now pretty much like a standard best practice. And also, we are really explicit about the racial equity competencies that we want to see in our staff when we put that into job descriptions. So we're explicit and we signal to BIPOC candidates, your lived experience matters for us, and then we actually score candidates based on their lived experience and on their familiarity with EDI. So the results have been pretty good. In 2019, 9 of 11 hires we did were people of color. In 2018, it had been about 50%, and I don't have the numbers in front of me for 2017, but I can guarantee you they weren't that. So, I have to admit that while I embraced having a more diverse team in principle, I was actually kind of resistant to some of these process changes because they were inconsistent with how I had done things. But it's actually been a huge lesson for me as a leader to trust the process and listen to folks and center your colleagues of color, and do things that might feel uncomfortable, because that is likely to be the only way to change the results.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything to share on hiring?
I think Jeremy's points were really good ones. I would just add, especially at higher levels in the organization, we have used recruiters to hire sort of my direct reports and some senior level leaders. And we've had a really set of mixed results, and some very big names in the industry have just failed when we've said we'd really like a deeper pool. And what we're trying to indicate is we're not going to choose someone because of the color of their skin, but I want to see the full range of options in the pool. And I think there are many more recruiters now who are out there who are really focusing on these really rich, deep pools. It's just harder. You got to work harder to do that. And I think that's something that CEOs can do. They can say, no, I'm not going to look at this list of candidates until you show me a more diverse list of candidates, because sort of the old way of, won't name the big names, I think we know who these big recruiters are. They just bring you the same old set of names and you end up with the same old results. So I think Jeremy's point around you got to change these systems that feed the way we hire. It's really important.
Yeah, I'll just echo that a bit to say that, and a lot of what Jeremy said in particular in terms of some of the changes, some of those we've done and others I'm inspired by, and we'll take a close look at. But to Curtis's point, you have to change the way you're sourcing talent, the signals you're sending to attract talented folks. You can't use the same process. You're going to get the same results. One other thing I'll just add is that one thing that's been successful for us is kind of intentionally building pipeline. So through internships, one of the things that's been successful is meeting candidates for roles who don't ultimately get the role, but who we stay in touch with and make it a different role down the road. And so sort of cultivating those relationships in communities where we might not have historically had a lot of connection. And then of course the obvious thing that folks talk about a lot that we've definitely found to be true first as we transformed the organization from a gender standpoint, and now as we're making great progress in terms of people of color in the organization and leadership positions, is you have to put folks in leadership roles. Otherwise, filling out the rest of the organization is going to be really an uphill battle. And so there needs to be a tremendous amount of focus, as I know there are for the other panelists, that you've got to make leadership has to look like the organization that you want to have, the diverse organization you want to have.
Thanks for that. So the Retention Project report called out the feelings of isolation and loneliness people of color feel while living here. Patrick, how is Tillamook using a cultural lens to make your employees of color feel more connected and able to bring their whole self to work?
So I'll mention a few things that we're doing. Starting with the interviewing and onboarding process, we want to convey and also create a space where first recruits, those who are getting to know us for the first time, and then new employees who are coming into the organization can feel a connected sense of our culture, where they can see themselves thriving and succeeding. So it's very important that we have great open conversation about valuing everyone in the organization, so that folks come in feeling like it's a place where they can bring their authentic selves. I mentioned before the idea of assimilation. That on my journey, that was one important thing to part of my educational journey here, is just the extent to which, while strong cultures with a lot of positive values can be very effective for the reasons that I talked about before, they can also be very off-putting for someone who feels like they're feeling pressure to act like everyone else. And, when we hire, we don't hire for fit, we hire for what can you add to the culture and the organization here. That means we're intentional about the fact that we want you to be here because you have a unique perspective and a unique view of the world, not despite that. And so, Secondly, I think just in terms of having people of color feel comfortable in the environment and in the culture, it's very important to make frequent, actionable, and public commitments to inclusion and diversity, and to creating an environment where everyone belongs. I mean, you have to be explicit about it. It has to be one of the critical strategies of the business. Third, we know that employees' experience at a company is most impacted by their direct manager. And so engaging in a lot of training of leaders on conscious inclusion and cultural agility has been a big focus for us. I can stand up and say whatever I want in the organization, but if that's not the way somebody experiences the workplace through their direct engagement with their manager, then it falls flat and in fact backfires. And then finally, by training and involving everyone in the discussion, not making it an issue of discussion only for diverse components of the culture and of the company, but engaging everyone in it. We're encouraging everyone to make inclusion central to the culture and for everyone to model inclusive behavior. So those are some of the things we're doing to try to make sure that folks connect with our culture and show up in the ways that they'd like to.
Thank you. Comments on racism and discrimination in the workplace were common complaints from those interviewed and surveyed in the retention project. Jeremy, I want to follow up what you said about culture earlier. As EcoTrust moved to change its workplace culture, what steps were taken to make sure EcoTrust's new culture valued differences?
Yeah, I liked what Patrick said about this idea that your BIPOC colleagues sort of bring value because of a different lived experience that they bring to the table, not in spite of it, right? I mean, that is really interesting to me. For us, my leadership team was overwhelmingly white. That was problematic for a variety of reasons. And our equity working group proposed that we transform that leadership team by adding a couple of more folks more BIPOC voices. And it was a similar case where I liked in principle the idea that our leadership team would be more reflective of the community that we serve, but in a really concrete way, that was going to mean adding people to our leadership team that weren't there for what had been the traditional reasons, which they oversaw some business unit or whatever. And so we added a representative of our BIPOC affinity group, which is a self-organized group of our BIPOC staff, about 20 folks. And so the proposal was that we add the leadership team, a representative of the BIPOC affinity group, a representative of our equity working group, and then we created a new position as a director of equity, and that all three of those folks would join our leadership team. And so we've done that. And those folks are at the table as full participants. They're not there in observer status. It is not a box checking exercise. And that has really materially changed the way that we discuss issues and make decisions as an organization. And, the concerns about, well, the group's too big, or is there going to be a power dynamic or whatever. I mean, there were some, I think, real concerns about how that was going to go. It's been an unequivocal positive as far as I'm concerned. The conversations, the richer, the outcomes we get are better. And frankly, the leadership team has more credibility with the rest of the organization because it is more reflective of the rest of the group. And so, again, I just want to own the fact that I wasn't completely comfortable with what that was going to look like, but had to just kind of trust that this was worth doing and that we were going to be better for it. And I think that we are.
So employee resource groups, or ERGs, which are sometimes called affinity groups, play an important role in helping retain employees of color. The Port of Portland has several ERGs. Curtis, in order to solidify DEI work, can you walk us through what the Port has done to create ERGs and how they are playing a role in helping to shift organizational culture?
Yeah, thanks, Chad. And I might use it to answer a bit of the question that was asked in the Q&A. Pooja asked a really good question around what were the mistakes I mentioned One of them was we didn't include employees enough at the outset, especially employees of color, Black, Indigenous, and other employees of color, to say, how does this feel? Is this about right? You know, a couple of the mistakes we made when we started, we said, well, let's just get some training in here. And we had some training that really put off a lot of people in the organization. And I'll say, actually, it helped us in the long run. But I spent the ensuing 2 years trying to kind of keep the people that were put off by that sharp training in the loop before I finally sort of accepted that that is not helping. Sort of centering the white experience in the organization is not what was needed. We created this voluntary training where essentially over 50% of Port employees volunteered. We didn't require it to learn more and engage on equity. So ERGs was one of the ways, these employee resource groups, that we tried to have employees help us get better, but also create an environment where employees with like characteristics or feelings or levels of engagement could get together. We've now got, I think it's 9 of them, and they are able to, on the one hand, build relationships themselves and between themselves, but also help inform the rest of the organization about what's happening. It's been a really great experience. And I'll note that one of the ways that we've been able to sort of see the big picture and the day-to-day at the same time is my commission president, for example, Alice Kupro-Comas, has really guided me and helped me understand what questions I should be asking. Michael Alexander, who many on this call know, is one of my commissioners. He has just persistently helped push us in a way to ask these questions around, well, what are you doing to make this employee focused instead of leadership focused? And so ERGs are certainly one way to do that. The range of ERGs at the port, I mentioned, maybe I didn't, we call it ABLE, the Alliance of Black Employees is one for sure, and Asian Pacific Islanders and Latinx and LGBTQ, but also Women's Development Network, and we have a book club. So there's a wide range of ERGs, and the idea is that's an upward pushing engagement that also involves an executive sponsor.
Great. Patrick, the Retention Project report shows that community plays a very important role in getting employees of color to stay in Oregon and Southwest Washington. Not being connected into the community was a primary concern for participants of the survey and the interviews. You addressed the community within your organization, but how can employers think holistically, not just in the silo of the workplace, to engage in the broader multicultural community?
Yeah, look, I believe that companies need to start by working inside out on this topic, on the issue of racial equity, and that we have a lot of work to do. I know we do at Tillamook and other organizations do as well. But I also believe that companies need to directly serve as a positive force for change in their communities. I mean, we're seeing eroding confidence in many societal institutions, and I believe companies have an industry has the resources, the capability, and frankly, the motivations to make changes, as well as the moral obligation. And so I do want to see us as a business and other businesses step up more on this issue of important social change. So, I mean, referencing our values again, one of our shared values is genuine care. It means that we support and care for the whole person that works on our team. Not just the employees' engagement with the workplace, and that means a recognition that there are challenges and experiences that employees have outside of work that present opportunities for employers to provide support. And another of our values is stewardship, which means we have a commitment to serve all the stakeholders impacted by the business, and in particular, that means supporting the development of healthy, thriving communities and shared prosperity in our communities. So we're inviting our employees to create space for them to participate in civic and local engagement on DEI and learning opportunities. So really there's two things that where I'd like to see companies do more of, and we're trying to lean into. First, we know our employees themselves want to help create positive change in society, and there are ways that we can support them in that. So we provide a number of, on a number of different topics. We provide resources, and specifically around the Black Lives Matter movement, we provide educational resources, venues to learn, organizations for them to connect with, and ways for them to share and engage in the ways that feel most natural for them, encouraging them to do that. But secondly, companies need to directly be a force for positive change in their communities. And I think it's really important that they do it in an authentic place to who they are and where they are. So for example, for us, that means supporting the voices and the organizations that need to be out in front on particular topics, rather than somehow trying to, position the brand into some kind of leadership position, when really we're not the authentic expert on various topics. So, we want to help put the right people and partner with the right folks to get out in front on topics like racial equity. And if it means using our brand in ways that are authentic and appropriate to our values, but without sort of grabbing the mic where we don't need to be grabbing the mic.
Great. So this is the last prepared question, and then we'll open up for audience questions. But Jeremy, Oregon has a racist history, which includes white supremacist policies and practices, which still affect us today. Learning about our history is a good step for employees to understand why Oregon is so white. What tools has EcoTrust incorporated to help employees learn about racial equity?
Well, to the earlier conversation around employee resource groups, I think for us it's been really helpful to establish, and again, this was staff-led, what we call anti-racism learning groups, because I think to a point that Curtis made earlier, when we were having all staff conversations, whether it was DEI trainings or it was courageous conversations and lunch and learns and all these things, they tended to end up being pretty white-centered, right? I mean, it ended up being a place where white colleagues were sort of processing what was going on for them. And our colleagues of color, appropriately, really, sort of spoke up and said, this isn't really doing anything for us. And in fact, it's doing us some harm. And so we now have anti-racism learning groups where I think that's been a really helpful forum for our colleagues, our white colleagues, to get together and read books or consume other media around anti-racism and work on that together, which I think has been great. We also realized that we didn't have explicit shared agreements in how we work together and how we deal with each other, and that the lack of those shared agreements sometimes created kind of an environment where microaggressions were more likely to happen, and it was less clear how we would address those, and that was problematic. And so we developed a set of shared agreements together, and now that's a really helpful accountability mechanism for us, whether it's in a bigger meeting or one-on-one conversations. So that's been really helpful too. And then, we've made a significant investment over the years in really specific DEI or anti-racism trainings for various groups. I mean, either all staff or a leadership team or specific teams. And I think that commitment really has to continue.
Great. I would add another great resource is an online equity conversation that Partners in Diversity recently hosted about Oregon's historic white supremacy structure. It was recorded and has been posted to Partners in Diversity's YouTube channel, and we will share that link in the comments section. So now we have a few minutes for audience questions. Mari has been keeping track of those questions. So I'm going to give it over to Mari.
Thanks. So one of the questions comes up about your leadership, diversity on your leadership team. So can you talk a little bit about what your leadership team looks like, and then how are you working to diversify it? I'll just pick somebody. Anybody would like to go first? Patrick?
I'm happy to start.
Curtis, thank you.
I have an all-white leadership team that is 40% female and 60% male. We recently lost our one person of color on the executive team, and we're recruiting now. And this is essentially the recruitment I was describing, where I really wanted to add diversity to my executive team, but the resumes I was receiving were not diverse. And so that is a point where we are trying, and I would say we've not done well enough, but it's a shift that is underway, and I'm really prioritizing it organizationally to say, I need a deeper pool so that I can see the very best candidate that brings the additional needs of this organization, which is different experiences and different lived experience. And I note here coming up in chat that there's a lot going on in chat. I'm not monitoring chat, but I'm monitoring Q&A. I'll just say it's worth us checking out what's going on in chat and maybe speaking to it. I'll leave that to you, Mari.
Okay, well, we only have a couple more minutes left, so I'm going to ask, could any of you share more about how they value lived experiences, including how they seek that information and how it gets weighed on the scoring sheet?
I can say a little bit about that. And I had kind of a hard lesson in valuing lived experience where, you know, in a pretty specific role where lived experience as a person of color and a true authentic network with communities of color was really valuable. And I think that I didn't fully get that. And I think the employee got that and got frustrated and ended up leaving. And it was a tremendous loss. And for me, you know, my personal commitment, in addition to the organizational commitment to it, was that, you know, we have to put that in job descriptions and we have to actually score it. Now, specifically to how that may score relative to other attributes you're seeking in a candidate, I can't give you a percentage sense, but it's a very, very important thing for us.
Yeah, I would just add that I also think that there's tremendous value in that lived experience. One of the big challenges, and I'm not going to say we figured out how to deal with it, but one of the big challenges is that if that lived experience hasn't played out in the career track up to the point where you're discussing, where you're talking to the person, it's really hard to get to in the way that we've traditionally sourced candidates and evaluated candidates. And I think that's the challenge where folks have, where that lived experience has not been valued throughout their career. You can't just look at what roles they've had and how they performed in those roles, because those experiences have not been brought to life in a way that should have played out in their career. So that it's an interesting challenge. I don't think I have the answer to it, but certainly we aspire to engage in interview and evaluation process that allows candidates to authentically express their strengths and experiences in ways that we hadn't traditionally done in the past.
Thanks, Patrick. So there's a question, there's been a couple about just, I know you guys talk about having a diverse leadership at the table or diverse employees at the table, but there are times when it's still uncomfortable and maybe there's some racial or gender bias that shows up. So how are you or your leadership teams addressing this in your organization?
I don't know, Patrick, if you're going to take it, but I'm happy to give it a go. Look, it's messy, and I think we are trying to train our people up to understand what the issues are, and also to talk about them frequently, and to engage in a way that enables the challenge to come from both the privileged white male and the person of color in the room who wants to say, hang on a second, and to have those challenges valid and heard. And so, you know, I think increasingly the push from our leadership team has essentially been, we want to keep this as a priority in everything we do. And that means in every room that we're in. And, you know, I think some of the comments reflect this. It's hard. And that's okay. I think also stumbling, as I mentioned, stumbling and just saying, yeah, we're going to keep trying, and putting your hand up and saying, yeah, we screwed that up. I, for example, put in our bonus system a prioritization of the number of recruits we had of people of color, and our existing employees said, you're devaluing my presence in this organization. And I think that's a fair pushback. And so we changed that metric, but you know, you're going to make mistakes. And I think part of the language of leadership you're hearing here from Jeremy and from Patrick is you got to keep pushing on those things and keep trying.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, Chris, and I'll just acknowledge that there's a range in the question. You know, the question's reflective of the fact that there's a range of things that leaders and organizations deal with, from systemic bias to unconscious bias and microaggressions, all the way up to fairly overt actions that need to, you know, behaviors that need to change. And doing a lot of training and discussion is important to try to equip leaders to deal with those things in the moment. You know, they're hard, messy problems to deal with, but we have to lean in. And one of the most important things, and I really appreciate Curtis saying this, is that modeling our own sort of willingness to lean into those difficult situations, and also willingness to be wrong sometimes and admit that and change and seek advice and learn and say, oh yeah, I got that wrong. How could we have done it differently, is absolutely critical until somebody develops the perfect formula that we can hand to leaders and train them on in terms of dealing with this range of really important critical issues that need to be addressed and need to be addressed frequently and directly. You know, it's gonna take all of us just kind of exhibiting and modeling the behavior of leaning in and learning and adjusting and driving change.
Chad, and back to you. We're out of time. Oh, you're on mute, Chad.
Apologies. Thank you, Mari. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I know we could talk about this for much longer, but unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thanks again to our panelists, Jeremy, Patrick, Curtis. I would like to thank Partners in Diversity for their work on this project. Go to partnersindiversity.org for more information about the Workforce Retention Project, research, and the list of solutions. Back to you, Mike.
Mike, you're on mute if you're talking.
Sorry, everybody. Again, thank you, Chad and Curtis, Jeremy, and Patrick for your time today and your remarks, and echo Chad's appreciation for Partners in Diversity and Dr. Martinez for sharing this incredibly important and compelling research. The time is now for all of us to take action and make changes in our respective workplace cultures and organizations. And I know at the Timbers and Thorns, we're engaged in that very process. It's clearly an ongoing journey, and as Patrick just said, we hope you all will join us in making a commitment to lean into this work and make equity and inclusion a priority. Again, thank you to our event partners, Oregon Business and Industry, Oregon Business Council, Port of Portland, and Greater Portland, Inc. And thank you to all of our members for taking time out of your day to be here with us. Make sure to mark your calendars for the Alliance's Building Business Connections that takes place July 21st. Emerging Professionals of Portland, their last Tuesday event is being held virtually on July 28th. You can register for these events on portlandalliance.com. And stay safe, everybody. We hope to connect with all of you again soon. Thanks again. Have a good rest of the day.